Let's start with the clip that started it all, because the specific words Harry chose matter more than almost anything else in this entire saga. Speaking to ITV, Harry laid out something that should genuinely unsettle anyone paying attention. He said the danger he's talking about isn't some vague, abstract anxiety. It's mechanical. It's specific. A person doesn't need a plan, doesn't need a network, doesn't need a political motive that anyone could see coming and stop in advance. All they need is exposure, knowing where you're going to be, and a single moment where the protection isn't there. That's it. That's the whole equation. I want you to actually process that instead of skimming past it, because that is not a man being paranoid. That is a textbook description of how targeted violence against public figures actually happens today. It's the exact language that professional threat assessors use when they're evaluating risk for people in the public eye. Harry isn't inventing a fear. He's translating a security briefing into plain English. And then came the moment that, if you were watching live, probably stopped you cold. He was asked point-blank what his grandmother, the late Queen, would think about him pursuing this fight the way he has. No pause, no hedging, no performance for the cameras. His answer was immediate. She would want him to see it through. Sit with that for a second. That's not a man who's still wrestling with whether he's doing the right thing. That's a man who has already made peace with his decision and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Now, here's where I actually want to give this particular panel some real credit, because it doesn't happen often. One of the panelists made a point that almost never gets airtime in this conversation anywhere in the UK press. Harry and Meghan live full-time in one of the more dangerous countries in the world by certain safety metrics, the United States, and they still travel internationally constantly for work, including a planned world tour. If Harry were simply trying to avoid all risk everywhere, none of that would make sense. He's clearly not opposed to risk in general. He is opposed to unmanaged risk, specifically in the one country where the state has already told him, through the RAVEC decision, that it isn't going to extend the protection his family used to have automatically. That distinction is everything, squaddies. This isn't a man who's scared to leave his house. This is a man who has run the numbers in Los Angeles, in Nigeria, in Colombia, everywhere his humanitarian and Invictus work has taken him, and landed on one conclusion. The UK is the single environment where the security architecture was deliberately pulled out from under him. That's not fear of a place. That's a reaction to a decision made by people who absolutely had the power to make a different one and chose not to. The panel also connected this to Harry's history without turning it into a spectacle, and I appreciated that restraint. One of them said it plainly. You cannot separate this fear from what happened to his mother. Princess Diana was followed, photographed, and ultimately killed in circumstances directly tied to people chasing her image and her location. So when Harry says a lone actor, he is not speaking hypothetically. He is a man whose entire formative understanding of fame comes from watching his mother not survive it. That's not overreaction. That's inherited evidence-based caution, earned the hardest way imaginable. There was another comparison raised almost in passing that I think deserves way more attention than it got. John Lennon. Not a politician. Not someone tabloids could paint as controversial the way they try to paint Harry. Just a globally recognizable person killed by someone with no coherent political agenda. Just fixation. The point being made was simple and honestly kind of devastating. Fame alone, with zero connection to any policy or position, is enough to make someone a target. You don't have to be a duke estranged from an institution. You just have to be known. That is the entire risk profile RAVEC was originally built to assess. And it's still, security review or not, exactly the profile Harry and Meghan carry. Now, in fairness, because credit where it's due doesn't mean blind agreement, one voice on the panel did raise a real tension. You'll travel to riskier countries, but not to the UK. On its face, for about 3 seconds, that sounds like a fair gotcha. It falls apart the second you ask who actually controls the variables. When Harry travels somewhere like Nigeria or Colombia for Invictus-adjacent work, his team can commission and pay for private security proportional to the actual threat, on their own terms. In the UK, that option was explicitly closed off. The government ruled that even privately funded security arrangements weren't sufficient, that only official RAVEC-sanctioned protection would do, and then declined to provide it. So it was never about the UK being inherently safer or riskier than anywhere else. It's that the UK is the only place Harry has been told, flatly, that he isn't allowed to solve the problem himself. That's the 15 extra seconds of airtime that conversation deserved and didn't get. Let's zoom out, because a lot of casual viewers hear security dispute and assume it's some minor bureaucratic squabble. It is not. This has been a multi-year legal battle, and understanding the timeline is the only way to understand why Harry's words landed the way they did. When Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties, RAVEC, the committee responsible for protective security decisions, decided Harry would no longer automatically receive the level of state-funded protection he'd had his entire life. Harry challenged that. He took it to court. He lost the first round, appealed, and lost the appeal too. Here's the part headlines tend to blur. The courts didn't rule that Harry faces no risk. They ruled narrowly that RAVEC's decision-making process wasn't unlawful. That's a much smaller finding than most coverage implied, but it was still a real loss. Then came the part I think deserves the most attention of all. Harry's team reportedly offered to privately fund his own security detail whenever he visited the UK, not asking taxpayers for anything extra, not demanding special treatment, paying for it himself, using former police or military personnel coordinated with local authorities wherever possible. That offer was, by all accounts, rejected or simply left to die in limbo, because officially sanctioned protection isn't something you can just buy. It comes with legal powers, database access, and police cooperation that private security cannot replicate no matter how much money is behind it. So when you hear Harry say he isn't bringing Meghan back to this country under current conditions, you are not hearing a man refusing to solve his own problem. You are hearing a man who tried to solve it, was told his solution wasn't acceptable, and was left with no alternative that meets the standard he believes his family needs. That context is what turns overreaction into the only option left on the table. Now I want to name something directly, because it gets danced around in almost every other channel's coverage of this story. When people ask why Harry keeps showing up in the UK alone, for Wellchild, for Scotty's Little Soldiers, for veterans' causes, while Meghan doesn't, the implication is often that she's simply choosing to stay away. Preference, distance, avoidance. What almost nobody asks is who benefits from that framing. It's a far more convenient story for certain corners of the press than the alternative, which is that a state effectively made one member of this family untouchable while leaving the other exposed. A convenient story doesn't require anyone to answer for a security decision. It just requires a wife who supposedly prefers to stay home. I think that framing isn't just unfair. I think it's backwards. By pretty much every available measure, Meghan is the more heavily targeted half of that marriage. The volume and tone of coverage aimed at her during the pregnancy years, in the fallout after the Oprah interview in the years since, has been documented and studied extensively. So ask yourself this: if Harry, a white man born inside the institution itself, can't secure adequate protection for a UK visit, what exactly is the argument that Meghan, a biracial American woman who has faced demonstrably harsher coverage, would somehow be safer walking those same streets with less security than her husband currently can't even obtain? That's not a rhetorical gotcha. That is almost certainly the exact calculus Harry has run in his own head over and over. Him showing up alone shouldn't be read as she didn't want to come. It should be read as he's the one parent who can get any semblance of adequate protection, and even that isn't guaranteed to be enough. There's a structural issue here too, and it's the thing that frustrates me most every time I sit down to cover one of these stories. Watch how differently Harry's own words get treated compared to words said about him. When Harry speaks in a documentary, in a legal filing, in a rare interview, it's on the record, his name is attached, and he can be quoted directly and cross-examined on it, which he has been repeatedly in court. When the opposing narrative gets built, the version where he's overreacting, where security is somehow being used as an excuse, where this is secretly about publicity, it's overwhelmingly sourced to unnamed palace insiders, unnamed friends, unnamed sources close to the situation. No name, no accountability, no cross-examination ever. I'm not saying every anonymous source is lying. Background sourcing has legitimate uses in journalism. But when you stack an on-record, court-tested, documented statement from Harry against an anonymous tabloid quote, and that anonymous quote gets treated as equally, or sometimes more, credible simply because it's juicier, something in how this story gets told has gone wrong. That asymmetry is, I'd argue, the single biggest reason public perception of this dispute is so much messier than the actual facts justify. One more thing stood out watching this segment. Nobody asked where William stands on any of it. Not his views on the security decision, not his relationship with his brother, nothing. That's probably outside the scope of a segment specifically about the documentary. But it's worth noting anyway, because this story doesn't exist in isolation from the rift. Every single time this security dispute resurfaces, it resurfaces without one word, publicly or even leaked, from William on whether he thinks his brother's family deserves protection when they visit the country of Harry's birth. That silence isn't neutral. Silence from the second in line on the safety of his own brother's family is itself a data point. And I think it's one more people should be saying out loud instead of tiptoeing around. So where does that leave things? Harry has said, about as plainly as anyone in his position ever says anything, that his family will not set foot in this country together until the security question is resolved on terms he can actually trust. That is not a threat. That is not leverage. That's a boundary set by a man who watched his mother die in circumstances directly tied to a failure to protect her, and who is not willing to run that experiment a second time with his own wife and children. In the meantime, he keeps showing up for the causes that matter. Well Child, Scotty's Little Soldiers, and the growing machinery around Invictus Birmingham 2027. Because none of those commitments require him to gamble with Meghan's safety to honour them. And Meghan, for her part, keeps building her own body of recognised work, including her recent Emmy nomination for With Love, Meghan. Proof, if anyone still needed it, that her career doesn't depend on approval from the very institution that has made it so difficult for her to safely set foot in her husband's home country. Squaddies, I actually want to hear from you on this one, because this particular segment modelled something we don't see nearly enough of. Disagreement without cruelty, scepticism without dismissal. So tell me, was the risk elsewhere versus risk in the UK question fair or unfair, now that you've heard the full picture? Is Meghan's continued absence from UK appearances being read correctly by the public, or is it quietly being used against her? And most importantly, is there any version of a RAVEC resolution both sides could actually accept, or has too much damage already been done? Drop your answers below. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the sharpest insight on this channel comes from you, not me. If this video helped you see today's story a little differently, do me a favor. Hit like, drop a comment, and send it to one person who still thinks this is just about Meghan not wanting to come back. Send them here first. Subscribe if you're not already part of this family, because we're not going anywhere, and neither is this story. Until next time, take care of each other.